the Republic? To what degree are they reflected in the educational curriculum in the Republic? And of course, obviously this is very important, vice versa. I think, just by way of introduction, it's very important. This particular approach, which was developed some years back, me ask, me Mishaguit. So, one nation, one culture. But we got the impression, I think, to some degree, that this is very heavily weighted in terms of the structure in the Republic, particularly a case that you mentioned more specifically about Yerevan, Erebuni, the capital of all Armenians in the whole world. So perhaps you might like to talk about these sorts of things, and maybe we'll get viewpoints from some of the others also.
Okay. Actually, I was talking about the elementary grade, but small. But very briefly, I would mention that Spurg is, of course, presented in textbooks further in further grades. It's all history textbooks, especially in culture part, have Spurg high part, and also each period which is described in the textbook have reference to Spurg. But this is also kind of separation from the nation, usually, I think. And also, Spurg part is discussed in the classrooms very much with teachers, with students, because any of the student has a problem with migration now, and this Spurg part is a theme which is currently about their families, about themselves. And I also spoke that teachers somehow try to touch this, but when I interviewed them, they also have no recipe for this. And I mean, this is a cliche words that they have to say during the classes. So this is another thing about Spurg. So Spurg is not only the Spurg that we knew, the classical Spurg, but Spurg also is those communities which have been created after 90s, so from people who are going about. So one small episode of my field research, this is a situation when they discuss what is the native house, Mahaydeni Dun, for example, and teachers have this formula. So maybe you can have a beautiful home in other countries, maybe you will have a good job, maybe you will become rich, but you will always need something in other countries, and this will be and this will always be bad for you, etc. So this is some discourse which is in schools, not in the textbooks yet, but during the class discussions I have it in the. As for my kind of expert opinion, if I could call it like that, that we need a concept which is for national or state identity, which would be inclusive and not exclusive. And inclusive means which it could include ethnic part, so Armenian part, and also non-Armenian ethnicities which live in Armenia. And it should include the civic part very heavily. So what does it mean to be a citizen? So what is the duty of the citizen? What is the responsibility, duties, tax paying, or I don't know, forming a good government, not taking bribes, not giving bribes. This kind of things should be also taught as a concept of state identity. And also the diasporic feature and character of the Armenian nation at all. So these three elements, I think that should be somehow included in a concept. As for the one nation, one culture, this is, of course, there are posters and there is also a festival about this, and there are many participants from all over the world. And this festival is, I also somehow studied the discourse about this. This is also part of the discourse. There is a huge segment of the society, expert and people who think about this kind of things, who somehow ridicule, if I may name this feeling and this approach, ridicule this concept, one nation, one culture. And there are really very interesting jokes, but I don't remember them now, about this one nation, one culture, one something and one other thing.
Would any of the others like to react to this?
Well, as a foreigner who has taught himself Armenian, I think, I think it can be important not to be too strict about how elevated the means of education should be. For instance, in my own case, I think one of the best means for me to learn Armenian has been listening and watching to Rabbi's songs and music videos, which have very simple, they're like very simplified versions of patriotic poems, love poems. I mean, like in a very low register, but you build up a vocabulary by listening to them, with which gradually you gain access also to, say, charents or things like that. So I think, and I'm going back, I think, to the issue that was raised earlier about Mgnig versus a more traditional approach, that it can also, if like the requirements are like too strict, that like Armenian can only be used for very high, like the highest culture, then it immediately already excludes a big part of everyday life that is not as elevated. And I think once you exclude those people, they are, and it makes it harder to win them, to get them excited about the language. So that's just my take.
One other topic that I'd like us to discuss, I think it's extremely important, is the role of diaspora in the Armenian setting. I think that this is extremely important, and I think that largely, perhaps, we have a false impression about that. I think that one of the key issues we should bear in mind here is the question of the relation of Armenians to territoriality. And what we find is that from a very, very early period, we find a large number of Armenians moving outside the home territory. And I think that this really should be developed, I think, much, much more. That, the other point is that in more recent studies of diaspora, we see that there are all sorts of different subtypes. And I think that you could argue that Armenians fit all of those subtypes. And I think that the importance here is that we shouldn't imagine that there is only one size which fits all. And that diaspora is not only, and in some cases not even primarily, associated with some sort of cataclysm, that there's a major war, there's a major earthquake, or some sort of activity of great dimension that compels a particular group to leave one particular area and move to another. That in many, many cases over many centuries, people, including many, many Armenians, have decided that it is better for them to move elsewhere, to find a better life for themselves, for their families, to exploit particular professional skills they have, etc. I think it's extremely important to bear that in mind. It seems to me also that largely in the homeland, there is that one particular perspective which, with which Armenians in the homeland view diaspora. Diaspora appears then as being this situation where the person has left, the person is on their own, the person is struggling, maybe in great difficulties, has no rights, has no network, basically, to protect them in the very difficult circumstances outside. However, one thing that we find from various types of diaspora writing in different periods is exactly the opposite. They are enormously positive, they feel very secure, they feel that they are on a rise, there is a tremendous sense of progress and advance, and in many cases, sometimes, they actually feel in a much stronger position than many of their countrymen back in the homeland. And I think this is extremely important for us to bear in mind in the present. I think one final point that I would like to make, and then to get reactions from the panelists, is that we should view diaspora as a process. And I think that this is very clear. This really takes us back again to the question of territoriality. Outside Armenia, however that is defined in any one situation, diaspora is basically a network which again is continually developing. So to understand it, obviously we're all in that situation one way or another. I mean, maybe a Scots diaspora, others are Armenian diaspora, etc., etc. But one of the key issues about our situation, about being in diaspora, is that it's not permanent. It's dynamic. And I think that we have to accept that and to recognize the benefit that this gives as well. That automatically the lack of permanence should not be regarded then as being this major negative that indicates then that there is no point in doing absolutely anything about the current situation because it's impermanent. But I would like to illustrate that with one or two points and then to throw it open for discussion. But I think that a very good example is some of those cases that are often raised. In fact, to some degree, you mentioned one or two of them. Often we hear about this wonderful Armenian diaspora in Poland. And this often is the introduction to a discussion of, yes, but it was completely wiped out. Or basically, there's no one left. Everyone was assimilated. Well, I think this is very significant in terms of the mindset which creates this narrative and sustains it. Because in fact, this is historically incorrect. Very often we find that diasporas face crunches, difficult situations where you have to make a decision, basically life or death decision. What will you do? And in many cases, what we find is that those who perhaps remain in that situation, yes, it's true that this ultimately is their end, but very, very many accept the challenge to further move inter-diaspora development. And so in the case then of the situation of the Armenian community in Poland, we find that a large part of the Armenian community that refused to be indigenized, basically to accept Roman Catholicism, to accept a sort of Polonization, they actually moved. And that's why in the 18th, early 19th century, we have this huge Armenian influx into Transylvania. They didn't come from nowhere, they came from Poland. The same thing perhaps is true, for example, with regard to the Hamshens. We talk now, it's almost as if we had rediscovered who the Hamshensis are, and there's a great deal of concern about those who have remained in that historic area. But again, I think it's very important that we bear in mind that the majority of that population, when faced with the alternatives, determined that it was better for their long-term future to leave that particular location and to relocate. And so, in fact, we have the majority of that population still continues, still exists, and as far as I'm aware, in many cases thrives up and down the east coast of the Black Sea. So basically Abkhazia, around Rostov, etc. So I think it's very important that we consider that, when we're looking at diaspora, we shouldn't think of specifics. And I think that this is enormously important in the present. We shouldn't think of, the Persian diaspora, the Lebanese diaspora, etc. Because diaspora really should be regarded as this much wider configuration. It's very striking, I think, that in our time, we have this major hub which is emerging in America. Obviously, I think that in many ways we can see from earlier examples that this indicates something of Armenian acumen, where we are at the pulse of where things are happening, major economic development, etc. There we see Armenians plant themselves. Where the dynamism is lost there and move somewhere else, we see they relocate and they create new centers there. So I think that this is a very, very positive aspect to this process that we should bear in mind. We shouldn't think in terms of, as I say, these specifics of the Armenian diaspora in one place or in another, and they're declining, oh, this is automatically a negative. It could be almost like a blessing in disguise. Obviously, we see to some degree the impact of that movement here in Los Angeles, and who knows, in another several decades, we will be moving somewhere else. But the key issue is that this is a human issue. It's not a question then of locations or buildings. We're talking about people, and where the people exist and where they are thriving. So also, ultimately, we presume that this applies to the culture as well. And I think that this is very significant, particularly in terms of Vana's talk, with regard to issues like photographs. Obviously, you can't take your house with you when you move, so continually moving into these sorts of areas which are more easily transportable. So in the 19th century, we're talking about photographs. In the current situation, obviously we're talking about more developed technology and the ability to move things, for example, online, which can be done much, much more easily than these grossly physical aspects of our surroundings. I'd be very curious to get your input on that.
I think that I guess I can only talk about diaspora and not necessarily about the Armenian discourse currently. Although even though when you were talking earlier, you were saying in Armenia, diaspora is currently not only the old understanding of spirit, but also the people who have left. And I kept on thinking about something we've always had in our Armenian literature, which is the idea of Bantu. So spirit and Bantu. Bantu is the person who works outside and has family back home. But there is something very interesting that Sima Abrahamian talks about, and it's the idea of being hyphenated Armenian. And I think that we all share this. We are Lebanese Armenian, but before that we are, I don't know, Aintab Armenian or this and that. And we certainly have a relationship with the places we have lived, the territory. But we always seem to keep the Armenianness. It's always something Armenian. So that's an interesting point, I think, that we have to acknowledge, because although I don't think that necessarily saying, let's say, I'm Lebanese Armenian, you're limiting yourself to that specific area, because if you go further, that person will almost necessarily also tell you that, well, actually, some parts of my ancestors were from somewhere else, and that connection is always there. About the network, I think that it is part of our identity. We have always cherished that wherever we go, even home, wherever we call home, we always have that connection to the family, because family is a very, very important aspect of Armenian, the understanding of Armenian identity, but also the acquaintances we have made at home or wherever we have called at some point home. And hence the development of photography in the Middle East, which in part was due to these connections we have made over several decades.
Anyone else?
Just to mention, Vana mentioned about network. There are many theories about diaspora, and one of them is the network, so that maybe nation or diaspora is network. If we try to discuss from that point of view, it is in the process, in the dynamics, as Professor Mkrtchyan said, but it is also a network, or it is somehow can be considered as network and can work as network with all these specific features that all networks have.
It's very difficult to speak after what you said, because it was very, very insightful. What I would say is that diaspora has, I think, historically been organic, as an organic entity, where multiple centers are, we're always interconnected and would influence each other and provide also support to each other. Throughout centuries, we've seen different communities that have arisen and declined. New Juba, India, Eastern Europe, you mentioned, Egypt, to name but four. But there's one thing that is important to bear in mind. They've always maintained some sort of connection or link with the homeland. I cannot imagine the fate of the Armenians if we were like Syrians in this nation-state world. So I don't know. I would question the fact that what if homeland as a nation-state disappears? What happens then to the super network we do have in the diaspora, which I agree is dynamic and always changing? And but what if homeland disappears?
I have nothing to add.
One third issue that I think is extremely important that we raised tonight is the question then of language. And I think that this is a crucial one in the 21st century. I think that in many ways, in the past, it has been much more central to Armenian identity than it clearly is today. And I think that in many parts of especially the diaspora, perhaps first and foremost here in North America, I think there are many groups that basically have given up. They've basically argued that language is not essential and that other aspects of identity are perfectly sufficient in and of themselves. We see other sorts of parables of languages dying. We should accept this as being inevitable and move on without it. But I'm not sure necessarily that that is so. And I think that it was very interesting to hear some of these presentations tonight about different sorts of approaches. I think that obviously one of the key issues that we have to bear in mind is very much contemporaneity. I think, especially with regard to language, with also, of course, education, it's extremely important to consider then the child. And of course, this came out, I think, very, very clearly in Korioun's presentation. So the child's world, which is very much of now, and how best to facilitate the development then of this full Armenian child to function in the 21st century. How obviously then the educational structure will enhance that or develop that further. And one of the issues, so obviously one is then what indeed is the role of language within Armenian identity. The second thing, which I think is extremely important, is precisely this issue that we're talking about of interconnectivity, of being part of some sort of network, and to what degree that can play a role in terms then of the education, the sociability of the child, the acculturation, and that, to some degree then, this sense then of the diversification of Armenians across the globe could be seen to some degree then as something worthwhile exploiting and actually having something to contribute, rather than continually being portrayed as a negative, a liability in Armenian identity.